All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of Gotham Writers Inside Writing. A quick reminder that if you've missed episodes 1 or 2, you can see the full episode on the Gotham Writers YouTube channel. So today we're going to be talking about literary fiction, but before we get into that, a few housekeeping notes as always. After we meet our panelists, you are welcome to submit questions for the Q&A portion of the webinar. After the panel discussion, I'll pick some questions from the audience and pose them to our panelists. There should be a little button on your Zoom window that says Q&A. You can submit your questions there. And at the very end, stay tuned for instructions on how to get involved in the Twitter pitch party. So on to the subject of the day, literary fiction. And as always, I'd like to begin with a quote, this one from Tim O'Brien. He said, "That's what fiction is for. It's for getting at the truth when the truth isn't sufficient for the truth." Isn't that the truth? So today's episode is extra special because we don't just have 2 excellent panelists, but we have our author guest who is represented by our agent guest. And we also have the query letter that connected the 2 of them, which we'll be looking at in depth during the discussion. So without further ado, let's meet our panelists. First off, the debut author of the novel Things You Would Know If You Grew Up Around Here, Nancy Wayson Dinan. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Josh. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And our second panelist is Curtis Brown literary agent Kerry D'Agostino. Hi, Kerry.
Hi, Josh. It's great to be here. Thanks again for organizing this today.
Absolutely. Happy to have you both here. So we'll start with Kerry. Kerry, we start every one of our discussions with a question like this. So I want to start with your opinion on what is the definition of literary fiction to you?
Yeah, sure. So again, thank you for having us here. Exciting to be here chatting about this. And I know, so talking about literary fiction and the definition. So traditionally, there's been something of a divide, I know, between what readers consider to be genre fiction and what readers consider to be literary fiction. And if we're working with that division, we might consider some hallmarks of genre fiction rather to be the following. We might start with an appeal to wide audiences, so readers who gravitate towards mysteries, romance, science fiction, thrillers, action, historical, books in those categories. We might be looking at books that adhere a little bit more to a specific formula. So, for example, we can all picture the traditional arc of, say, a romance novel. There's a meeting of 2 characters. There's intrigue between them. There's some sort of obstacle that the relationship faces. And then there's the overcoming of that obstacle. And that sort of plays into the more conventional storytelling that we tend to see in genre fiction as well. Writers of genre fiction aren't always looking to reinvent the wheel with how they're telling their stories. There's a clear movement from exposition to rising action to climax, falling action, and denouement. And along with that, there's a focus a bit more on plot. As much as genre fiction might feature compelling, complex characters, the focus is not as much on who they are as it is on what they're doing and how what they're doing is affecting them. So literary fiction, on the other hand, doesn't traditionally follow as much as a formula as what I've just described. And it often features more creative or experimental ways of storytelling. One example I always think of around this is my client, Leslie Petrick, whose novel Silver Girl actually starts with a section that's called The Middle, proceeds from there to the beginning, then to the end, but then to a final section that's called Where Every Story Truly Begins. And there's a clear reason for that, even though it doesn't sound like the clearest in how I'm describing it now. But it's very much rooted around this character who isn't ready to acknowledge certain things about her past. And so we don't get to those things about her past until the end of the actual book. But that becomes a huge part of her literary journey. And it's a part of the climax that Leslie weaves into the narrative, because even when it's experimental, there still is that following of the traditional arc. This brings us to the next distinct feature of literary fiction, though, that focus on character over plot, and the inherent exploration of some aspect of the human condition that comes with that deep focus on character. And of course, all of this is wrapped up in the other classic feature of literary fiction, which is the beautiful writing that often accompanies this kind of exploration. But all of that being said, I do always think it's really important to acknowledge that genre fiction, literary fiction, all of these categories, they're certainly not mutually exclusive, and it's definitely possible for writers to exist in both worlds. At Curtis Brown, one of the examples we always use is our client Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11, which is literary fiction set in a post-apocalypse. Or you could also look at any of Ben Percy's novels, which are as likely to feature werewolves as they are a reimagined Lewis and Clark in a different kind of Wild West. There's if we're talking about traditional definitions, though, what people usually consider literary fiction to be is the focus on character and humanity, along with that beautiful experimental writing. Oh, and I will start my video now. Thanks, Josh.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. Thank you for that in-depth answer.
Yes.
Nancy, wanted to see if you had anything to add to that. What's your interpretation of what literary fiction is?
So that was a really thorough answer that addressed a lot of the things that I think about too. And I love Station 11 as an example because I think that Station 11 does have that traditional arc, but does have that experimental part of it, especially the actual Station 11 part in that novel. I do think that I approach it in a slightly different way, just because I think that this book ended up being categorized literary fiction because of the weird expositional parts. But for me, I have to confess that I wasn't thinking of where it would fit when I was writing it. So I think as a writer, I'm just writing what interests me, and playing with structure in the way that I am interested in playing with structure, and that then the categorization happens after that. So Kerry, I'm impressed by how thorough that answer was. You addressed a lot of things there.
Yeah. Well, and I would also add to what you said, Nancy, that, the advice that we always give our clients is not exactly what you just said, not to think about the category until you have the novel. And then we can start thinking about how to market it and how to reach readers in different categories. But it has to start with the book and what the writer's vision is for that. So yeah, I agree with what you said too.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with the focus on language too. That with the experimental it's paired with that focus on language that's often lyrical. And for me, I think that was the language I was interested in, like trying to create. So yeah, different perspective, but a lot of agreement.
So Kerry, to follow up on this distinction between different genres, especially around this area, how do you draw the distinction between literary upmarket and commercial fiction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think with what I was saying about genre fiction, that can kind of go into the same category as commercial fiction. That's usually what people are thinking of there. And so if we then move into upmarket fiction, it's sort of, I don't want to say catch-all, but it often is used to describe books that fall somewhere in between those two ends of the spectrum. And the client that I think about when I think about upmarket fiction on my list is Andrea Boboti's The Last List of Miss Judith Pratt. And one of the reasons I think about that is because there's a lot in that book that does suggest maybe a more literary fiction siding. There's two different timelines that she's exploring. There's a deep focus on the titular character, Judith Pratt. Much of the story unfolds around Judith's listing of an inventory that she's taking around her house, so there's some experimental writing around that. But at the same time, there are other elements that you could classify as more traditionally genre. There's a murder mystery that's informing a big part of the overall story. There's complicated sister dynamics that are recognizable to anyone who's had a sister. And then there are also elements of the 1920s timeline that read as more historical fiction. So when you kind of combine all those two things together, you wind up with a book that asks big questions, that's very well positioned for book club discussion, but that's also very accessible. And those three things tend to be sort of the hallmarks of upmarket fiction. And it's also worth noting, you'll hear from editors and agents a lot of the time that they're looking for something that's in that sweet spot between commercial and literary fiction. And you can debate a little bit about what that actually means, but often it is an editor or an agent who's looking for something in that upmarket space.
Nancy, I find it interesting that you didn't consider, like, especially in your query, which we'll get to later, you didn't identify it as literary, and you said you didn't really consider yourself writing literary, yet you were adhering to a lot of the, I hate to say conventions because literary is not conventional, but you're playing with structure. I mean, when did it occur to you that you were writing literary fiction?
This is a really good question, and I'm thinking about it too in the terms of what you just described, Kerry, as being having big questions but being accessible. I don't know when it occurred to me that it was literary fiction. I do feel like I was influenced by the books I was reading at that time, which would fall into the literary fiction category. And for this book, I think I thought a lot about Samantha Schweblin's Fever Dream, and this sort of momentum that went through that book, and how one thing led to the next thing, led to the next thing. But it's not like on a traditional 3-act kind of arc, right? And so the resolution for this book, I definitely feel like is not. It takes it away from that commercial space, right? It's not a resolution that you might expect in a commercial book. So I think I knew when I got to the end that it was not a commercial book. But I also I have also tried to write commercial books that would fit into commercial categories before, and I knew going into them that I was writing those things. So I used to belong to a genre writing group, and I would know that, okay, here's where I need to have this thing happen. And when I was writing this book, those weren't the questions I was asking. Like, when do we have this second act betrayal? When do we have this dark moment where it looks like nothing can be solved? So I knew that I wasn't following, and I feel like formula sounds pejorative a lot, and I don't want it to sound that way, but I knew I wasn't following any specific like genre formula.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, again, a question I can't really answer. I don't know when I realized that.
No, I think you did answer it. You answered it very well. So, Kerry, I want to sort of get one more take on the difference between commercial and literary. Is literary? It's often said literary is a harder sell than commercial. Do you find that to be the truth?
I wish I could say no. But I love literary fiction dearly, and I work with a lot of it, and I do, it can be a tough sell in the traditional publishing market. And I think that one of the reasons that is that when you're working with literature that follows, for the most part, this tried and true design, while I agree with Nancy, I don't want to limit it to just calling it a formula, but literature that you can automatically classify, okay, who the readers of this are, then you're working with the readership that's a little bit more tried and true as well. And the result of that is that publishers have a more concrete sense of the kind of profit that they can expect and how to publish the book accordingly. So in the more genre space, you can do that more. In literary fiction, because there is this more experimental push, there's a more of a focus on that character development. They don't have necessarily it's more like rewriting how they're reaching the readers with each book, and that's not something that Big Five publishing can always be as nimble about. So it really just boils down to publishers are businesses, and they can be very hesitant to take risks. And literary fiction, just because of everything that we've been talking about, has more inherent risk to it. But that being said, we're definitely seeing different ways of publishing literary fiction today. We're seeing a lot more activity from independent presses, from small publishers, that I think is really pushing forward the conversation and reaching out to readerships in new ways that publishers, the bigger ones too, are learning from. So I'm cautiously optimistic about, one day it might not be as hard as it is now.
So, Nancy, with this being your debut novel, were you thinking publication right away? Was that something that had been on your mind from the moment you started, or was it kind of something where you got midway through and you're like, maybe I could get this published?
So I think it is my debut novel, but it's not the first novel that I've written, right? And I find that a lot of us have like a lot of novels that they've written, and this was the first one that I seriously queried. That was always the expectation. I mean, not the expectation, but the hope. Let me say that. That was all with this one. I feel like by the time I started writing this one, that I felt like I had practiced this craft for a while, that I have learned a lot, that I'd gotten a lot better from when I started. It had been more than a decade since I'd been writing novels, and so I don't. That was the hope the whole time, that I was writing something that other people would read. But I don't know if that was the expectation. I think these are two different things.
Mm-hmm. So I want to shift into a little bit about what writing literary fiction is all about. And I think one concept that always comes up in conjunction with literary fiction is this idea of the human condition. So Kerry, I want to start with you and what this term means and how it appears in books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I have never taken a course in philosophy, so my answer it's the best I can do. But when I think about the human condition, I'm thinking a lot about who we are as people, obviously, how we're interacting with the world, what we're hoping to accomplish in the world, and what we're doing with the obstacles that are thrown in our path, and sort of within and around all of that, how we're caring for our people and making decisions for not just ourselves, but those that we care about. And I know that's really broad, and maybe that's why literary fiction can be so complicated, because there are so many different ways to sort of go into that question. But that's also what I love about it, and that's the kind of writing that I get the most excited about.
So Nancy, in terms of your book specifically, do you see it as addressing this human condition thing? Did you consciously approach that, or did it just kind of happen to fit with it?
So I have to agree with Kerry that it's a sort of a broad answer. I don't know. I will say that I was specifically looking at something in the book, and that is the question of what empathy takes from you. I think that we would all agree that empathy is a very valuable, worthwhile trait to have, but that it can also take from you. And so that was something that I was exploring. So in some small way, I think, perhaps, I think that for me, exploring the human condition means like dwelling with complexity and like allowing people to be complicated and good in one respect and difficult in another respect. I tried to be honest with my characters. I tried to show, scenes in which they responded in a very noble way and scenes in which they responded in a very selfish way. I also think that, if you're talking about the human condition is tempered with both good and bad moments. So, this is such a hard question to answer, but I just tried to be honest too with not only the characters and their responses to things, but to the things that actually happen to the characters. So some good things happen to the characters, but also some difficult things happen to the characters. So, and then I really liked what you said about caring for the people around you, Kerry, because I do think that I was really interested in the relationships that people build, and how sometimes those relationships are uneven. And so that was definitely something I was exploring here. I don't know if I thought of it in terms of like exploring the human condition, but I was definitely thinking in terms of empathy and about what that costs people. So
you both answered that very well. You should give yourself more credit for what you were able to explain there, because I've been trying to explore the human condition for a long time, and I still couldn't give you a better answer than what you just gave. So thank you for that. So Nancy, one of the things that sets your story apart is the namesake of the book, the things you would know sections. Can you tell us a bit about what your objective was with these and what they were?
So I don't know that I had a real objective. I find things really interesting. Like I get very excited about just information, and I love, I'm from Austin. I love that area. I love, going somewhere and discovering that something has happened on a certain spot. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to put all of those interesting things that I discovered in the book. And then that extended to climate change, because that was part of the question that I was exploring in the book. The challenge, I think, was how to make those work in a narrative way. Like how do how do you put all this trivia in a book and then make it work? And so I was really interested in connecting things to like the cause and effect in the story. So an example would be in Central Texas, if there are purple blazes painted on a fence, that means no trespassing. Or even if there's not a fence painted on like the trunks of trees. And so you should not pass whatever line that is because it might be being monitored. And in Texas, you might be shot, maybe. Who knows what somebody's going to do if you pass that line. And so I included that as one of those expositional sections, that little bit of information. And then like 30 pages later, we see one of the characters cross one of those purple lines. So we know that we have some information about what that means. So for me, what I really wanted to do was just include all of these things that I found so interesting, but then also to make them connect to the cause and effects of the narrative in the story so that they meant something. And one more thing I want to add here is just, I find as a reader, one of my favorite experiences is when I have more information than the characters do. And I just think that is just such a great experience. And so I try to increase that sort of irony where the reader is aware of something that the character is not. And so that adds to our worry or to the conflict or to something in the story. But the main reason I included those was I just liked them. I was really interested in them. So
I like how all these answers tie back into it's just what you wanted to do. I think that's great. Kerry, from the way I took the things you would know sections, it feels like something, with the publishing industry always saying you have to do something that's the same but different. It felt like something different, something that sets the book apart. Is that kind of how you saw it? And how do you interpret this whole you have to do something different? When there are so many books out there, how do you do something different?
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting question. And to be honest, I can't say that I did really necessarily approach these sections from that perspective, immediately thinking about marketing. I think more what I was thinking when I was reading it is that it was so fascinating. I was learning so much, and like Nancy said, reading about what purple blazes represent in one section, and then seeing the character encounter the purple blazes in the next, it just added so much more tension to the story, but also so much more color to the world that she was building. So I think that that just got me really excited. It did give me a little bit of something to talk about more with editors when I was pitching the book. So I suppose from that marketing standpoint, you could make that argument. But I think it was really just more, I learned so much. It was, and Nancy includes everything from the purple blazes that she mentioned, to beautiful snippets of poetry, to Carl Sagan's pale blue dot speech, to lost silver mine. So there's just like she said, it's trivia, and I think people find trivia interesting, and they especially find it interesting when it weaves into the narrative in interesting ways. And on that note, I don't want to spoil anything, but Nancy, you did manage to work a really fascinating subplot into the things you would know sections, and I think that has a great payoff for readers as well at the end.
So another thing I want to touch on before we get into the query letter, since literary fiction is so character-based, Nancy, the story is very focused on the main character, Boyd, and what's going on in her own internal journey. How do you keep things interesting for a reader whenever most of that journey and most of that advancement happens internally?
That's a really good question. I think of other examples where this is true. I'm really interested in interiority. I find myself really responding to that in novels. And I think of a couple of Stephen King novels, especially where things happen. I'm thinking of The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon or Gerald's Game, where things happen in the book, and I don't want to say that they're in defense, but so much of what happens is the interiority of the character, and it still keeps me turning pages. I just really respond to interiority. That's a really good question. Why? I think it helps me to understand the character a little bit better. I find myself in really sparse novels where there's not a lot of interiority, wondering why something happened. I think that if you don't have that interiority too, you have to do a lot of clue reading and like the way something happens, or like the way somebody responds to something. And I think this is maybe even just a matter of like taste or aesthetic. But for me, I think of like John Gardner's fictive dream, where we want to be part of a story rather than to be aware that we're reading. And for me, interiority takes me into that fictive dream much more effectively than a story that maybe lacks interiority. And I think that's probably just personal preference, right? That we all respond to something artistically in different ways. So yeah, I don't know if I really answered that other than by saying I like it in other books. So.
Which is a perfectly fine answer. And I did want to follow up on that real quick. Just from a crafting standpoint, how much did you know about Boyd when you started writing the story? Or did you sort of like fill out a character profile and know everything about her? Did she surprise you along the way? Did you get to know her along the way?
This is a really good question. So Boyd is one of those things in fiction that happens sometimes. I think most writers at some point where you start to question the origins of that thing, and you can't really answer those questions because I don't know. So Boyd came about because so there's a scene very early on in the book where Boyd is gardening and like a bean tendril wraps around her, and that was the original scene in the book, and or the original scene that I wrote. I knew Boyd was very empathetic. She became more empathetic to people as I wrote, and less empathetic to the earth. That was the initial plan for Boyd. Plan is such a like. That's the wrong word, but she evolved, I would say. But I feel like I knew. It's such a cop-out answer, but I feel like I knew Boyd when I started thinking about her. And so she did deepen for sure. She did, especially like her relationships with other people. But I knew that Boyd was highly empathetic, that it cost her to be around people, and that people would try to exploit that. So again,
it was a good
oblique answer.
No, it was a perfectly fine answer. So I have a lot of other questions I want to get to, but I want to share the query letter now so we can see what it was that connected you two. So I'm going to share that real quick. Give me just a second. All right. All right, so you should be able to see the query now. For those of you that are listening and not watching, I'll go ahead and read it real quick. It says, "Dear Ms. D'Agostino, I'm contacting you because you represent Anne Valente, and I think you would be a good match for my novel. Valente writes lyrical, place-based fiction that is often heavily researched, and my work follows in these footsteps. My novel, Things You Would Know If You Grew Up Around Here, is set in the aftermath of the Memorial Day floods of 2015 in central Texas. These floods broke every river in Texas and resulted in massive loss for property and human life. Even today, people remain missing. In the novel, the young woman Boyd sets out across the backcountry to rescue a friend who has been trapped by rising floodwaters. In the process, Boyd, who has always been acutely empathetic, realizes that she can see the world slightly differently in the wake of the storm. As she walks, she discovers that the edges of time have blurred and that the past is bleeding into the present. The narrative alternates with expositional sections, the things you would know, and these reveal environmental and historical information that gradually come to bear upon the larger story. These sections operate in much the same way as the wiring diagrams and schematics do in Our Hearts Will Burn Us Down." And then she goes into her bio. So Kerry, when I first reached out and asked if you had this query letter, you mentioned that it was perfect. So I want to ask you what it is, as concisely as possible, because we will go into more detail, but what was it that struck you as so perfect about this query?
Yeah, so right away, Nancy is mentioning a client that I've worked with, and not only by name, but by specifically mentioning what Anne does in her writing that Nancy is doing in this book. And so that's right away showing me that she spent time with my list. She's taken the time to research me and see whether I would be a good fit. And she also sounds like she'd be a good fit because this is something that has been exciting to me in the past. That description is just so intriguing. I actually was thinking as you were reading, Josh, I think at least a few lines this ultimately made it onto the jacket copy of the book, which is what we should be thinking about in these sections of the query letter. How do we ultimately want to be pitching this to readers in that concise way? And then, of course, she's also showing the really significant background experience that she has that shows why she's the right writer for this novel. And the other thing that I always like to mention too is that, Nancy, at the end here, you say, as your submission guidelines request, I'm attaching the first 50 pages of the novel. And I do request online in my profile. I watch the query letter in the first 50 pages. And it's amazing how few people actually read that instruction and follow it. So when I do see that from a writer, that is an indication to me right away that there's someone who, again, has taken the time to really research this process and is being very intentional about what they're doing, which says good things to me about how we might work together in the future.
So Nancy, your opening is very concisely personal to Kerry, citing one of her other clients, as we've mentioned. How much research had you done before querying? Had you read Valente's book before you queried her and thought this would be a good agent?
Yes, absolutely. So with my book, I had gotten sort of some feedback that I should get rid of those expositional sections, and some feedback that people liked them, with readers and with workshops. And I knew that I really liked them and I wanted to keep them, but that they were very unusual. And Anne Valente's book was a really good example of somebody who did something similar, not in quite the same way, but she, in Our Hearts Will Burn Us Down, but then also in a book that came out after that, The Desert Sky Before Us, Valente includes these sections that to me feel like primary sources, almost like we're discovering the story along with the characters. And so I wanted to query Kerry as the agent for those books because I felt like those were things that I really valued and that I wanted to keep, but that were really different and that I could easily see being sort of edited out. So yeah, I had read Valente, and that was very important to me. So.
And how many other people had you queried?
So, so I actually did 2 small rounds. The first round, I had gone to Sewanee the year before, and I had met 3 agents there who were interested in seeing more. So that was the first round. And then one of the, one of those agents never responded. One agent said, I'd like a little more momentum in the book, and then one agent said, I'd really like to read this. I've got a lot going on right now. It's going to take me a while to get to it. And so then I did the next round, which I think, if I'm correct, it was 3 people again. So.
Mm-hmm. All right, so Kerry, this query arrives in your inbox. Were you the first to see it? Did you have a reader? Do you have a reader that screens initial queries, or did you open this up and read it first?
No, I opened this up and read it first. I would say I immediately opened it when it popped up in my inbox, because again, I could see that Anne was there in that first line. And then it just sounded really fascinating. And I think I read the first 50 pages, if not in that same sitting, then maybe later that night. And then I think I actually looked back at this in preparation for this webinar, but I think I requested the novel maybe a couple of days after getting the query, and then I wrote to try and set up our call maybe 2 days after that. I couldn't put the book down once I did start reading it.
I'm always curious from an agent standpoint, because with how many queries you get, I feel like you have to know pretty early on that you're interested in offering representation. Did you know that as soon as you read the query, or did you have to see the pages first? Or
I do have to see the pages first, because you want to make sure that even when you have a fantastic query letter, you have to make sure that the manuscript matches that, of course. For me, if I'm reading something that quickly and having that hard of a time putting it down, I know my gut is telling me, this is something that I want to spend more time with, and I really want to be able to work with this writer. But the decision that I make to actually offer representation doesn't come until we've had the chance to actually speak on the phone. Because I can love a book and not be the right representative for it if we don't have that personality fit as well. And I do tend to be pretty editorially involved with with my author. So I always like to have that conversation as well. But I know with Nancy, I was absolutely walking into that call thinking like, all right, I really want to offer. I hope that we get along. And then I did.
So another thing that fascinates me about query letters is the comparable titles aspect of this. Now, Nancy, you used one of Kerry's clients, which is awesome. I wanted to ask Kerry, you've mentioned this a little bit already, but how big of a role did that play? And in general, how big of a role do comparable titles play?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of this conversation actually comes back a little bit to what we were talking about in terms of literary, commercial, upmarket. The best value of the comp titles in the query letter and in submission letters that we ultimately draft for editors is to really indicate to that next person on the chain, whether it's the editor, the agent, the salesperson, the retailer, who is going to be buying this book. Where it is going to sit in the marketplace. And that ultimately, it helps me start thinking about where I could ultimately pitch the book. It helps the editor and the sales team start thinking about how much they can offer for the book, what kind of sales techniques they'll have to use to connect with people. And it's ultimately, it's all just adding to the kind of toolbox around the book. You give us more to work with when you give us those titles to be thinking of at this time.
So, Nancy, I have to ask this, and I know it's always a dicey question for writers, but how confident were you when you sent this query? Did it feel like every other query out there?
I don't know. I don't, because I don't think that you can ever really gauge this. But there's a reason that I queried this book. I felt like I had put in a lot of work and effort to become better at this, and I put in a lot of effort to really make this book the best that I could. I felt confident with what I was doing, but I don't know what if I also felt like I felt like I was genuinely querying Kerry, and not, sending a bunch of queries out. So I felt like I genuinely felt a connection to Kerry. I was not 100% sure that would be reciprocated, right? As always happens when you're sending emails out. So I felt good about what I was doing. I was not 100% sure that there would be a response. So
right. I like what you said about genuinely querying Kerry instead of just querying a whole bunch of agents out there. I think that's an important distinction to draw. So I want to talk a bit about the way you started your query. So you deal a lot with the setting right from the start, three lines in a row that just establish the setting. And setting is such a big part of literary fiction. So Kerry, I wanted to talk to you about how big of a part setting plays in not just in the query, in this particular query, but in literary fiction in general. How big of a role does setting play?
I would say for me, it plays a big setting. I know, we're talking about the human condition a lot in this conversation, and I think that in addition to wanting to understand the human condition through literary fiction, I'm always looking to understand places through literary fiction, and often how the two connect. We were talking a little bit earlier about what in things you would know if you grew up around here keeps things moving. And I wanted to just share, I think that a lot of what Nancy does here is to really effectively weave in the tension of the time and the place around what these characters are experiencing. The whole book unravels over a period of a couple of days, and it's very clear, what the missions of each character is. Boyd is off to find her friend. Her mother, Lucy Maud, is trying to find Boyd. Her neighbor, Carla, is also trying to find Boyd. And what they encounter in the landscape, which really does take on this position of sort of the fourth protagonist in the book, is what defines their journeys from there. But there is always this pressure of they need to get to where they are going, and they need to get there before it's too late. The landscape plays into that in a really significant way, and what they're discovering around the landscape plays into it in a significant way. So it neither surprises me, nor, I think the setting has the place that it does here in this query letter, because it has that in the book, and that makes sense to me. And I think it's one of the things that readers will really appreciate about it when they do pick up the book.
So Nancy, this might be kind of a silly question, because correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you're a native Texan. Is that what drew you to this setting? Was this just a very personal setting for you to deal with?
That's a really good question. So I am a native Texan. I was born in Austin. I have spent roughly half my life in Austin. I went to undergrad in Austin. I haven't lived in Austin in a while, although I did spend a year there a couple of years ago. And so one of the things that happens when you feel really connected to a place and then you leave and come back and leave and come back is you notice all of the things that change, right? And so it's like this really where if you stay, these things disappear slowly, and so you don't notice them as much. But when you come back, it's just this real sense of acute nostalgia. I don't even know really what to call it. But I was definitely interested in the idea that we're losing these things, right? So I think that when I returned to Austin, I'm not in Austin now, that I'm always surprised by what we've lost in a year, in 6 months, something like that. So definitely interested in the setting, but also interested in the setting as it changes. So.
Mm-hmm. So one last thing about this query before we get into audience questions. I find it interesting because there's a magical realism element to your story as well. There's a scarecrow that gets up and walks. There's vines that kind of take on a living persona. That isn't really touched on in the query, though. Nancy, did you leave those out on purpose, or did you consider these magical realism?
No, you're absolutely right. I'm looking at this query now, and it should really mention that that magical realism. And the only thing so there's the acutely empathetic, which might sort of hint that there's something extra there, but then the edges of time and the past is bleeding into the present. I'm looking, and that's the only indication that there's a magical realism element. And I agree. If I were to do this over, I don't know that I would say magical realist.
Well, one thing I'll add to that, though, is that Anne Valenti does, in the same kind of way, have magical realism writing some of her books. So I think between that and the past leading into the present, which absolutely caught my attention right away, I guess I couldn't say for sure. It's been a few years. I don't know for sure if I read this and knew to expect those elements, but I wasn't surprised when I encountered them. Yeah, I was excited.
All right, so I'm going to take this query down now. We're going to get to some questions. Actually, before I, is there anything else I didn't mention about the query that either of you wanted to draw attention to before we get into audience questions? Nope.
That was really thorough.
All right, great. So I want to start with a question. Nancy, I'll direct this to you. How do you approach the research part of your writing? You mentioned a lot of research, especially with the things you would know segment. Do you mostly do the research beforehand or afterwards during the rewriting, or how did you handle it?
I would say a mixture of both. So I'm always interested in like historical markers and guidebooks. I love those kinds of things. So I'm always doing that kind of research without realizing that well, maybe I kind of realize at this point that I'm always kind of looking out for things that I want to include in something. But then there are things that come up, like, so I've heard all my life that there's more gold in the ground in San Saba County than there is in circulation in the world. And so that I wouldn't consider that research as much as like growing up in that spot. But then when I want to include that, I want to go find out what that's all about. And so then I'm doing a mixture of like traveling to those places if that's feasible. There's a Texas State Handbook online that's really helpful, Texas Parks and Wildlife. There are all kinds of oral histories in the Texas Hill Country. One of the things that I find really, really interesting is that there's a giant Army base outside of Austin called Fort Hood, and it's giant, and that they moved people off of that land roughly 100 years ago. And before they did that, they went and recorded all of these oral histories. And so, so that's that's something that I turn to sometimes. Like there's a lot of archiving going on in the textile country that I find fascinating. So I start by being interested in something, and then I do extra research when the story requires it.
Mm-hmm. So next question goes to you, Kerry. As an agent, when you get a query letter for a literary novel from someone who has no writing degrees or publications, what do you need to see in that query letter in order to believe the project is worth reading? Do you look differently at those query letters?
No, I wouldn't say I would. If it's a query letter, again, to make it stand out the most, does reference some work that I've done, does use comp titles to help me see where it could fit into the marketplace, and does give that really engaging description of what the book is about. As long as I find that description interesting, I'm going to open and start reading and take it from there. I think that more where I see, if an author does have an MFA or some other degree or previous credentials, then that just allows me to start thinking about, okay, again, and if we're thinking of the toolbox, okay, so these are things that I can use to make editors pay more attention, that I can build into my strategy for pitching this book. But if a writer doesn't have those, then that's just not something that we're adding to the toolbox, but we'll just come up with other things instead.
Mm-hmm. And to follow up on that, a kind of related question, does having an online presence make a difference for literary fiction authors?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that you do want to have somewhere that agents can reach you, that readers can find out about your work. So that author website is an important thing to have. As far as some of the other social media platforms go, Twitter, Instagram, etc., what we usually suggest to authors is to find the platform that works the best for them. And for some that's image heavy, and that would be Instagram. For some that's engaging in conversations, and that's Twitter. But I think that the thing that we recommend across all platforms is that you're not. The best way to use these platforms is to engage in that literary conversation, is to support other writers as much as you're promoting your own work. If you're just going online and saying, buy my book, then it goes back to a little bit of what Nancy mentioned before in terms of establishing genuine connections with people. And that's not going to feel as genuine, that's not going to feel as connected. Whereas if you do engage in the literary community, there are a lot of really wonderful people out there, a lot of wonderful writers looking to support everyone, all these authors as a whole. And that's where it can really be most useful to I think, writers working with their publication.
Mm-hmm. So Nancy, next question to you. As a writer, how do you choose the book's narrator or point of view? Was it just kind of what felt right? Because that's kind of what I'm getting the theme with this book, was that you just kind of did what you wanted. But at what point did you settle on the point of view?
So Kerry, we had a conversation about this early on with this book. So what I wanted with point of view in this book is just, this sounds terrible, I wanted to do whatever I wanted with point of view, but not have anybody notice. But to be able to move from head to head without it being jarring or disorienting. So there's, I don't want to say too much, but there are two different points of view. There's like an omniscient kind of that mostly follows Boyd, but then there's also a different point of view in here. There's a first person that happens occasionally. I don't know that was a really conscious decision, but I will say that I have been writing some first person stuff for another project I'm working on, and it feels like such a relief. After writing third person for so long, with first person though, that comes with its own challenges. Like how do you reveal information when that narrator can't be there to see that information? But I think I think it's the voice I start the project in, and I've very rarely changed that. I think that's sort of one of those intuitive decisions that I'm not really sure where it comes from.
Thank you. So here's a question that we get a lot, and it's one of my favorite to ask. So Kerry, I'll ask it to you. What are some of the biggest query letter no-nos that you will see come up and you're just like, absolutely not, just because of this one thing?
I probably shouldn't take this as personal as I do, but I definitely notice when my name is just butchered, which, I know it's not the easiest last name, but still. Another absolute no-no is don't ever send your query letter and whatever sample pages to more than one agent on the same email, that's something that everyone is just going to go ahead and delete in all likelihood. You want to make sure that you're sending it to an agent who represents books in your category. That might seem like it's obvious, but it saves everyone a lot of time, because if they're not someone who's experienced in your field, they're not someone that you want representing your book to begin with. That's another place where comp titles can be really helpful as you start to think about where your book does fit into that literary conversation, what your comp titles are. You can start doing research to see who represents that, like Nancy did with me and with Anne, and that can help you to start build your submission list and be able to make that personal reference. But it is clear, again, like Nancy said, in terms of feeling, you can tell which letters have been genuinely crafted to me and which just have my name plugged into them. And I think that the more you can make your query letter personal in that way, the more chances you have of standing out in the right ways.
Mm-hmm. So Nancy, a question going back to the things you would know sections. How did you structure the alternating between the story and these expositional sections? Did it happen naturally as you wrote, or was it carefully planned?
It was definitely not carefully planned. It was an experiment that I tried. I don't know if it happened, if I would call it natural, because it is so weird. But one of the first things I had to try to figure out was how to signal that those were the expositional sections. And that's where that title, Things You Would Know If You Grew Up Around Here, because those expositional sections have that, so you're clued in. But then they also have like a quick, underneath that title, there's a quick line in italics that say what the thing is. So it's like a summary of that section. So part of what happened, I think, with this book was trying to figure out how to signal those sections, and basically like how to teach somebody how to read this book, because it is different. So that was part of what I was trying to figure out. I definitely didn't want to have those in like dialogue, or to have those in like interiority, where to go back to the purple blazes, where Boyd is thinking, oh, purple blazes mean no trespassing, right? I liked the exposition, and I wanted to figure out how to put that in there.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, something that we haven't mentioned about these sections yet, which I think is important in this conversation, is that things you would know if you grew up around here. There's something about that immediately invokes the reader and makes them a part of the journey, because they're things that the reader would know if they grew up around here as much as they are the characters. And I think that does a lot for the reader engagement throughout the narrative too. It makes us feel like we're a part of this.
I like that.
So a question for Kerry, and I think this is a good question because I still find it interesting how, Nancy, you didn't classify your book as literary fiction in the query letter itself. So Kerry, do you find it useful or inhibiting to have an author characterize the work as such, to put literary fiction, commercial fiction, women's fiction, and so on and so forth?
Oh, I definitely find it useful. If for some reason I have read the query, I've read the novel, I'm talking with the author, and I don't think that it's necessarily the right category, then maybe that's a conversation we'd have together before going out to editors. But it does help me sort of set my expectations for what I'm going to be reading as I open it.
And Kerry, another quick one to you. Within how many pages in the manuscript does it go before you know that you want to keep reading? Like, how far do you normally get before you can tell if this is something you want to keep going with?
Mm-hmm. On average, I think that somewhere around, say, the first 2 or 3 chapters of a book, when I see it on submission, I can start to feel myself. If I'm starting to think like, oh, if I'm getting really engaged with the character's journeys, if I'm starting to think about, oh, I know this editor who's going to be really excited about this, or when I get to the point certainly where I'm starting to think about, oh, this is so great, but like, what if we did this with it? And I'm starting to sort of turn on the editorial part of my brain. That's when I know, okay, there's something here, and can't wait to see what's next.
Gotcha.
2 to 3 chapters is so much longer than I actually expected. I expected like 2 to 3 pages. So that's good to know that you have that long.
Query letter does really give me a good sense of what I'm going to be opening to. Okay. I don't want to be misleading. I definitely don't have the bandwidth to read the first 2 or 3 chapters of everything that is submitted to me.
Okay.
But once I am intrigued enough by the query letter to be reading the manuscript, yeah, that's usually how long I'll try and give her projects before deciding.
All right, so 2 last questions before we wrap up here. Real quick, I just want to hear 3 literary novels that you feel like every aspiring literary writer should read. You've mentioned a bunch throughout, so if you want to repeat some of them, that's fine. But we'll start with Kerry.
Well, the first recommendation I would make. But also I mentioned Emily Mandel earlier. I think that she's a really great one to follow in this space. Let's see. I'm just looking at the books that I have here, so I'll take a second to also plug Liza Whelan. She's a really brilliant literary fiction writer as well. This is her most recent novel, Paris 7 a.m. And she also does a lot of really wonderful work around making the interior space of a character accessible and exciting. So yeah, those are a few that come to mind immediately.
Perfect. And Nancy, any suggestions? Doesn't have to be 3, just as many as you can.
Okay, yeah, I'm thinking about them. And so for me, I'm going to show my Texas bias here, but Larry McMurtry is just so funny and witty. And I think we think of literary fiction as being like really lyrical and ponderous. And McMurtry does something different with it. Definitely Lauren Groff and Karen Russell are coming up for me. Elena Ferrante, those Neapolitan novels, she does so much with that tension between those 2 women that it goes for 1,000 pages. And you just keep reading it. Definitely Samantha Schweblin. Too, but also I'm sorry, this is way more than 3, but Carmen Maria Machado, if you're working in like any domestic fabulous space or magical realism space, I would Carmen Maria Machado, Helen Oyeyemi. There are a lot of readers that I think, or writers who I think of are really redefining that, and you know, Isabel Allende, gorgeous writing. Yeah, I have a lot.
That's perfectly fine. So last question, maybe 1 sentence or so of advice that you would give to literary writers, people that want to write literary fiction. What is one thing you would tell them as advice? We'll start with Nancy this time.
This is a tough question. So I think that the advice I would give people, that I would give students or anybody who is wanting to write literary fiction is, I would tell them to try to be interesting. And this can mean a lot of different things. I remember in my MFA when I was trying to be interesting, and it reminds me there's an Emily Dickinson line about art is a house that tries to be haunted. I'm not getting that line quite right, but that at some point I realized that the things that I found interesting, other people might find interesting too, right? So I didn't have to like create this fake interest. I brought in things that I found inherently interesting. I don't know how. I think everybody comes to this in a different way, but the advice I would give is to be interesting and not just try to be interesting, which is not great advice, but to try to figure out the thing that you bring that other people would be interested in. So,
Kerry, how about you?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I would also just add to your, as a writer, you're a reader too. And the more you read books that are existing again in the same kind of world that you're hoping to bring yours, the better off you'll be in terms of, you know, finding a way into that world. Just knowing again what books are you're going to be in conversation with, because it is a literary ecosystem full of authors, full of people who love books, and the more you know what's happening in that conversation, the better.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree with that. Yeah, that's great advice.
All right, so that's all we have today for literary fiction. I'm going to go into how the Twitter pitch party works in a second, but I want to say thank you to our guests, and you all are free to go. Thank you, Kerry and Nancy, for being here. Thank you for your insight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Josh.
Absolutely. All right, I'll see you all later. All right, so for everyone that wants to get involved with the Twitter pitch party, I'm going to go ahead and share. Sorry, we're going a little bit over today. I just want to share We just put these up on the website for how to get involved with Pit Gotham. This is, if you have a literary fiction work of your own that you want to pitch, go on Twitter, use the hashtag Pit Gotham, and you have until Friday to do this. So you have until Friday at midnight. We will go through and pick out some of our favorite pitches and send them on to Kerry for feedback. So we also have some tips and tricks. I'll go through them real quickly. Make sure that you condense your book into a single tweet. Multiple tweet pitches are not allowed. If you have more than one book to pitch, you may pitch them all. Just make sure you use separate tweets for each. Also, try to come up with a good comparable title or two. It's a great way to sort of classify your book very quickly. Point number 3, more of a tip, but focus on what makes your book unique. Usually that's the protagonist and the main driver of the plot. You don't have to worry so much about setting the scene because you just don't have the space to do that. Point number 4, end it with a hook, something enticing to get the agent wanting more. And then lastly, again, make sure you include hashtag PITGOTHAM. If you don't include that hashtag, we won't be able to find it on Twitter. So make sure you include that. That does take up space in your tweet, so make sure you leave room for that. Other than that, thank you all so much for joining us as we talked about literary fiction today. Next Wednesday, we will be talking about young adult fiction, and registration is currently open on the Gotham website. So hopefully I will see you then. Until then.